Peronism is one of the most frequently misunderstood political forces in Latin America, and it is uncommon to find anything positive written or spoken about it in English. This is partly a legacy of Cold War politics. Perón tried to position Argentina as a leader of the Third World or non-aligned movement of countries that would be independent from both the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc. And the United States government punished him by carrying out a smear campaign against his government that included the publication of the infamous Blue Book by the State Department, in which the United States government tries to blame Perón for the pro-Axis foreign policy that Argentina maintained several years before he came to power. But I think an even more basic reason why Peronism tends to be criticized by non-Argentines of diverse political persuasions is because it is an ideology that just doesn't fit on the conventional left-right ideological spectrum. It is nonsensical to try to position Peronism to the right of socialism or to the left of conservatism. Instead, Peronism glares up at all of these other ideologies from below. It bitterly critiques them in ways that make the holders of these creeds feel defensive. But more importantly, Peronism assimilates both the best and, in many cases, the worst of what these other ideologies have to offer. And this makes it easy for outsiders to look at Peronism and find at least one thing that they do not like. The left tends to see Peronism as Latin American fascism, while the right sees it as thinly veiled Marxism, and liberal centrists fixate on Peronism's cult of personality and its contempt for many of the norms of liberal democracy. And in a movement as diverse and internally contradictory as Peronism, there is a grain of truth in each of these critiques. The Peronist movement did contain fascistic death squads, along with socialist revolutionary guerrilla groups, and these far-right and far-left Peronists would spend much of the 70s trying to kill each other. The Peronist movement also contained both labor leaders and capitalists, social movement activists and corrupt machine politicians, and also Democrats, authoritarians, and anarchists. All of these currents are part of Peronism, but none of them really capture its essence on their own. In this video, I am going to introduce the contradictory and chaotic movement that is Peronism by recounting the mythology and origin story that Peronism tells about itself. The point of this is not that this story is true or false, but rather that millions of working-class Argentines believed it. They clung to this story during their movement's long years of proscription and repression, and they wove it into one of the most potent and enduring political identities of the 20th century. In this video, I am intentionally presenting a sympathetic account of Peronism. Then in the next video, I am going to present a more critical account of what this style of politics meant in practice once it came to power. The story of Peronism begins not with the man Perón, but with the people who would form the movement. The onset of the Great Depression in the early 30s led to a collapse of international trade that devastated Argentina's agricultural export economy. No longer able to make a living in the countryside, many rural Argentines were forced to migrate from the provinces to the urban slums or villas miserias outside of Buenos Aires and other major cities in order to compete for the industrial jobs that still existed. It was this new proletariat that would form the primary social base for Peronism. Because these migrants came from Argentina's interior provinces rather than from overseas, this new proletariat physically looked different from the mostly European immigrant proletariat that had existed in Buenos Aires decades earlier. This new proletariat was much darker in complexion, and it had a greater share of both indigenous and African ancestry. Peronism's opponents would gleefully latch onto this fact when criticizing the movement. Many of the slurs leveled against the Peronists in the 40s and 50s were racial in nature. The mostly white anti-Peronists called their enemies cabecitas negras, or simply negros, which they meant as an insult. A congressman from the Radical Civic Union would famously refer to them as the aluvión zoológico, or zoological downpour, implying that they were mere animals rather than human beings. Other epithets focused on their supposedly poor manners or low class, including terms such as grasa or fatty, groncho or commoner, and of course the most famous one of all, descamisado or shirtless. An entire decade before they would consolidate into the Peronist movement, these migrants were already being told by Buenos Aires' white middle-class residents that they were not welcome in their own country. This racial and class-based prejudice was at the heart of the conflict between the Peronists and anti-Peronists. This conflict was not an ideological battle between the left and right, but rather a culture war between low and high that pitted Peronist subaltern groups against the historically dominant, well-educated, comfortable and white middle and upper classes. Now, the 1930s were a difficult time to be a worker in almost every part of the world. But this was an especially degrading period for the Argentine working class, since their own government was actively trying to screw them over. Argentina's democracy had been overthrown in a right-wing coup in 1930, though the general who led this coup soon stepped down due to his poor health, and he handed power back to the oligarchy that had governed Argentina prior to 1916. In some ways, this oligarchic government of the 1930s resembled the old national autonomous regime. But the way that it conducted itself was far more offensive, because it maintained all of the trappings of democracy while draining it of its substance. The regime held regular elections, and it not only allowed but even encouraged opposition parties to participate in them. But this was no democracy, and this period of Argentine history has since become known as the Década Infame, or the infamous decade. The regime maintained itself in power through blatant electoral interference and fraud. Its agents attacked opposition activists on the streets. It pulled opposition voters out of the voting lines, or it would let them cast their ballot, and then it would send a policeman to follow them home and retaliate against them and their family. And in one of the most notorious low points for this regime, it assassinated an opposition congressman by literally shooting him in the back on the floor of the Senate in the middle of a Senate session. It was obvious to everyone at the time that this was an undemocratic oligarchic regime. But the most damning thing of all was that the opposition parties kept acting as if nothing had changed, as if they were still living under a genuinely democratic political system. They competed in elections even though they knew that those elections would be stolen. And they encouraged their supporters to turn out and vote, even though they knew that doing so would put them at risk of being beaten up or killed by the agents of the regime. The reality of these parties' strategic calculations was more complicated than this, but to many disillusioned opposition supporters at the time, it appeared as if their party leaders were more interested in growing fat off of the perks of office than in actually challenging this corrupt oligarchic regime that had made a mockery of democracy. At the end of the day, this was not a regime that could be defeated simply by voting harder. And by participating in these sham elections, and by serving as a loyal and incredibly feeble opposition, these so-called democratic parties were helping this regime legitimize itself. The outrages of the Década Infame form an important part of Peronist mythology, because they clarify that Peronism did not displace a healthy democracy, but rather a pathetic caricature of pseudo-democratic proceduralism that was incapable of any genuine accountability or responsiveness. Peronism was a symptom rather than a cause of the institutional degradation in Argentina that began at least 16 years before Perón came to power. And much of the Peronist critique of purely procedural liberal democracy is rooted in the memory of this pathetic farce of the 1930s. The Década Infame ultimately came to an end not through an opposition election victory, nor through a mass uprising, but through another coup in 1943 that was organized by a group of nationalist military officers who were worried that the oligarchic regime would pull Argentina into the Second World War. And it is during this new military government that the leader of the Peronist movement first takes the stage. Juan Domingo Perón was an important ideologue for the nationalist officers movement, but he was only a colonel at the time of the 1943 coup. And so he was appointed to a cabinet position in the military government rather than one of the more senior positions. This turned out to be a very fortunate thing for Perón's political reputation, because it enabled him to distance himself from the more repressive aspects of this regime, while also furnishing him with the resources to develop his own base of popular support. After briefly serving as Minister of War, Perón is appointed as the new Minister of Labor, and he uses this office to forge an alliance with Argentina's labor movement. During his 2 years in this position, Perón issues a number of pro-labor decrees that establish a minimum wage, paid vacations, severance compensation, a labor grievance system, and a social security system. These reforms improve the material conditions for the Argentine working class, but they have an even more important psychological effect on the masses of workers who had been suffering under oligarchic rule for over a decade. The workers had been told again and again by the oligarchs, but also by the opposition leaders, that it simply was not possible for them to have anything nice. But here Perón is proving them wrong. He is demonstrating that the state does not have to serve the oligarchy. It can serve the Argentine people instead. While all of this is going on, Perón is also becoming involved in one of the greatest political romances of the modern era. Perón and Evo Duarte met for the first time in 1944 during a fundraising event for the relief efforts following an especially devastating earthquake in San Juan earlier that year. Evo was already a popular figure by this time, and her relationship with Perón transforms him from a mere champion of the working class into a romantic hero in Argentina's broader mass society. The military regime can see that Perón's star is rising, and its leaders briefly appoint Perón to the position of vice president in an attempt to benefit from his growing popularity. But this provokes a backlash from the more conservative sectors of the military, who are outraged over Perón's pro-labor reforms. On October 9th, 1945, Perón's opponents within the military successfully get him stripped of all of his positions and sent to the political prison on Martin Garcia Island, where the former radical president Hipólito Yrigoyen had been sent after he was deposed in the 1930 coup that had inaugurated the Década Infame. Meanwhile, the military government is now searching for an exit strategy, and there are ongoing discussions about transferring power to a civilian government that would be led by the Supreme Court Justice Roberto Repetto. However, this is an extremely controversial decision because Repetto is deeply associated with the old oligarchic regime of the 1930s. And in fact, he played a central role in legitimizing that regime by giving it the veneer of legality. Many working-class Argentines are now worried that a civilian government headed by Repetto would mean a return to corrupt oligarchic rule, and that all of organized labor's gains over the last 2 years would be lost forever. The country's largest labor federation, the CGT, calls for a general strike on October 18th to protest the expected transfer of power to Repetto and to call for genuine democratic elections. But on the day before that strike, on October 17th, Argentine workers start pouring into the city of Buenos Aires from the working-class suburbs on the periphery of the city. When the government realizes what is happening, the police attempt to stop the workers from entering the city by raising the drawbridges across the Riachuelo or Matanza River that separates Buenos Aires City from Buenos Aires Province. But the workers swim across the river anyway. They make their way to the Plaza de Mayo, which is situated between the city hall, the cathedral, and the presidential palace, the Casa Rosada. While the CGT had a whole list of demands that it was going to push for in the general strike, the main demand of this crowd that has assembled on the Plaza de Mayo can be expressed in just a single name: Perón. Give us back Perón. As they wait for the government's response, some of the workers cool their feet in the water fountains on the plaza, and they look around at the crowd. The dictatorship of the 30s and early 40s had been an incredibly isolating and lonely period for many of these workers. And a significant share of them are migrants from the provinces who had to leave their homes and families behind relatively recently in order to move to the city. But on the Plaza de Mayo that day, they recognized that they are no longer alone. There are hundreds of thousands of people here today. Hundreds of thousands of people with the same anxieties, the same hopes, and the same name on their lips. The hour grows late, but the people on the plaza show no sign of leaving, and they prepare to camp out there throughout the night. But then, shortly before midnight, it finally happens. The military government actually produces Perón. He is brought out onto the balcony of the Casa Rosada so that the people can see that he is alive and unharmed. And from the balcony, Perón addresses the crowd. He begs them to disperse peacefully, but he also promises them that this is just the beginning, and after a few days of rest, he shall return to fight alongside them, shoulder to shoulder, even to the point of exhaustion, if that is what it takes. As the people file out of the Plaza de Mayo that night, they understand that they have won. They have brought Perón back from the dead. On October 16th, it was conceivable that Perón would retire into obscurity. But that is no longer an option by the morning of October 18th. The military government announces that there will be new elections in February, and the people demand that Perón be their candidate. Perón receives the support of the labor federation, the CGT. Many of the labor leaders still had their reservations about Perón But the events of October 1945 have convinced enough of them that the fate of the labor movement is inextricably intertwined with the fate of Perón himself. Only a Peronist government could possibly safeguard the labor movement's gains of the mid-40s. And so the CGT and other labor organizations sponsor a labor party to serve as the political expression of the working class, get Perón elected to the presidency, and fill the Congress with labor leaders who will continue the reform process that Perón has already started. Perón is also supported by a second party, the progressive wing of the old Radical Civic Union, or UCR, which consists mostly of the followers of the deposed radical president Hipólito Yrigoyen. Most of these Yrigoyenista radicals were not present on the Plaza de Mayo on October 17th, but they have proclaimed Perón to be the late Yrigoyen's political heir, and therefore the symbolic continuation of the democracy that was overthrown in 1930. The incorporation of a significant part of the UCR into the Peronist movement provides a good illustration of the movement's inclusivity and its acceptance of diverse political strains into its ranks. It does not matter who you were or what you believed on October 16th. It does not matter whether you were a revolutionary syndicalist or a radical or a socialist or even a conservative. As long as you stand with us now, all of your past political sins are forgiven and you shall have a place in our movement. The incorporation of the Yrigoyenistas is also useful to Perón because he wants his movement to be about much more than just the labor movement or just the working class. In practice, Peronism is a predominantly working class movement at this point that is pitted against the middle and upper classes. But that is not how mid-20th century Peronist discourse portrays it. Instead, Peronist discourse places the dividing line much higher. Peronism is not the expression of a single class, but of the people itself, including people from non-working class backgrounds. And Peronism's enemy is not the middle class or even the upper class, but the oligarchy specifically. For the generation that has lived through the Década Infame, the word oligarca is a powerful one that connotes all of the misery and humiliation that the working class had to experience during the 30s. And the Peronists are hoping to channel this popular anger against the previous regime into their movement. Meanwhile, the anti-Peronist political establishment is trying to make this 1946 election a choice between democracy or fascism. And to that end, the anti-Peronists form a broad alliance called the Democratic Union that brings together traditional centrist and center-right parties like the conservative anti-Yrigoyenista sector of the UCR and the Progressive Democratic Party, along with traditional leftist parties like the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. These four parties were the main opposition parties during the oligarchic regime of the 30s. By joining forces now, they are hoping to demonstrate to the voters how serious they are about defeating the threat that Perón potentially poses to democracy. But by excluding the party of the oligarchy, they are hoping to make it harder for the Peronists to paint them as stooges for the oligarchs. However, two things greatly undermine this democratic union. First, the party of the oligarchy, which is now calling itself the Democratic Party, endorses the Democratic Union anyway, and it even forms a joint congressional list with the Democratic Union in some provinces. The Democratic Union is also endorsed by Argentina's major business associations and the Association of Landowners. So the Peronists are able to make a pretty strong case after all, that the Democratic Union is the option that the oligarchy supports. Second, the Democratic Union also receives the vocal support of the government of the United States, which interferes openly in this election on the side of the anti-Peronists. And in this case, this election interference backfires spectacularly, because it enables the Peronists to portray this election as a binary choice between the United States and Peron. You can either be governed by Braden, the US ambassador to Argentina, or you can be governed by an actual Argentine patriot, Juan Domingo Perón. Those are your only two options. And since the United States is not exactly popular in Argentina at this time, this really is not a difficult choice. While the Democratic Union's candidate, Jose Tamburini, has the support of Argentina's entire political establishment from the far left to the far right, Perón is able to defeat him by a comfortable margin. Meanwhile, the two pro-Perón parties sweep the 1946 legislative elections, and they win over 2/3 of the seats in the Chamber of Deputies. Most of the non-Peronist seats go to the UCR, while the two traditional leftist parties, the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, do not win a single seat between them. Viewed from a distance, Perón's 1946 inauguration might look like a military regime handing power to one of its own members, similar to the 1931 election of Sanchez Cerro in Peru that we covered in the videos on the Peru's opera. But the events of October 1945 drastically alter the significance of this transfer of power in Argentina. After October 17th, Perón has ceased to be a representative of the outgoing military regime, and he became instead the candidate of the people. And the Peronist movement is therefore able to celebrate this 1946 election result as the people's victory as well. After all, it was the people who had gotten Perón to this point. It was the people who had revived Perón's political career on October 17th, and it was the people who had carried him to the Casa Rosada. However, as Perón accepts the presidential sash, and as Perón's supporters celebrate their victory, there is still a largely unresolved question about what role, if any, the people would play in this new Peronist government.